Welcome to Season 8, Episode 1 of Solarpunk Presents, in which Ariel and I discuss the history of inequality and what sort of extraordinary measures it takes to bring it down. Christina here. I recently read a fascinatingly, depressingly eye-opening, academic-ish book about inequality. The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century was written by Walter Scheidel, a history professor at Stanford, and was published in 2017 by Princeton University Press. For the past 2 months that it has taken me to get through it, because it's dense, I've been alternating between rage and horror. I mean, honestly, I feel like the solid ground of everything I understood about civilization and government, including democracy, has been pulled out from under my feet, and it's not a nice feeling.
You've been telling me about this book for months, and I urge you to explain it to me on a podcast episode because I'm keen to know what exactly this book has to say that so badly shattered your outlook on the world.
In a nutshell, that mass violence and enormous catastrophes are the only forces that have ever, or probably will ever, reduce inequality, because that is the only way to destroy the fortunes of the rich. But unfortunately, an awful lot of people have to suffer and die for this to happen, and I don't mean just the rich. Meanwhile, during times of peace and prosperity, the rich always get richer, as inequality inevitably marches toward the maximum level that is possible for a society to economically and culturally sustain. Because even the most progressive of governments aren't stopping the rich from taking an ever increasingly greater portion of the pie to the detriment of the rest of us.
Tell me how this breaks down.
Walter Scheidel, the guy who wrote the book, has decided there are four major forces capable of driving leveling events, which he conveniently calls the four horsemen of leveling. He names them as mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolution, state failure, and plague.
I think you'll have to add climate change to that list in like a revised edition or a sequel at least, even if having five horsemen no longer carries the biblical connotations of apocalypse.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. If we don't get our act together to deal with climate change before it starts to get worse and worse and worse, to the point where we start having frequent heat waves that each kill hundreds of thousands of people, and frequent widespread crop failures that cause great famines and send economies into free fall. But that might end up getting filed under state failure, since that's the point the troubles that climate change will cause might need to get to, not just to kill people, but to drive a significant leveling of inequality. I mean, you kind of need a crystal ball to say for sure. Although, what kind of leveling truly catastrophic climate change might bring about and how. And this Scheidel guy's a historian, not a futurist. And this book is about history, not the future. Except to say that Scheidel doesn't think we have it in us to significantly level inequality peacefully. Sorry, we jump into the chase there. The wealthy and powerful never go down without a fight and have rigged the state to protect their interests and promote their ability to nab an ever increasingly greater proportion of the wealth produced each year.
I think I'm starting to get an inkling of what shocked and enraged you, though. Like, this is a pretty bleak outlook.
Right? All my life, I have had faith in the state. Sure, conservative parties have always served big business and the wealthy elite, but I was still clinging to the quaint notion that the progressive parties have at least fought for us little people and had our best interests at heart.
That's the version of politics that I grew up with as a kid, yeah. But learning about what Canada did historically to different groups of people, like the Chinese, the Ukrainians, the Japanese, the Germans. Of course, when I learned the truth about what happened to Indigenous peoples here in undergrad, I think I might have been exposed to more skeptical attitudes about my own government during my formative years than you. I think my main takeaway from my own family's history of migration after European World War to Canada, which was full of xenophobia and histories that the government was actively discouraging people from learning, was that governments are sneaky bitches, full of men who are prone to rage meltdowns, and the rest of us just have to take it and get by somehow. But I still believe in the power of people to be well-meaning and make systemic change by protest.
To my poor little mind and faith in Western liberal democracy, and all the politicians I have ever voted for, even the ones in the Peace and Freedom Party, not that they ever took office, is that even under the most progressive of governments, allegedly all servants of the people, in times of peace and prosperity, the state has always protected and promoted inequality rather than actively working against it. Even the most progressive of governments, especially in my home country of the USA, not that it's ever really had a progressive government, have failed to protect their citizens from endless rising wealth and income inequality.
It's my opinion that all political systems or ways to organize society are able to be made into terrible things, though. Like, I think all humans are susceptible to becoming monsters when given power. Okay, well, I'm curious to know about how Scheidel came up with his four horsemen of leveling.
So he's a historian, and he's reconstructed as best he could the history of inequality stretching back into, well, prehistory, using, among other things, archaeological evidence, which households were eating well and getting buried with lots of expensive artifacts versus how many weren't, that sort of thing. And then, at least during the last several thousand years, records of taxes, land ownership, and wages. Then, when you see times when inequality is considerably leveled out for a reasonably long period of time, it's fairly easy to see that they haven't just happened by themselves, these leveling events. Something pretty seriously horrible always happened first. I mean, really seriously horrible. Seriously, seriously horrible, where a disturbingly large portion of society dies and loses
Mm.
everything as well.
This is an inappropriate time for me to make an Ian Nasir meme reference, but I would like to acknowledge that this meme speaks to the fact that economies and inequality have always been with us.
Okay, I am not hip to this meme because I'm not hip, but a quick internet search has revealed to me that it is based on a Babylonian clay tablet from nearly 4,000 years ago, upon which a customer complains to a merchant that he has been sold substandard goods. But you, with your have always been with us, you've hit a pet peeve of mine, which is this: the poor will always be with us, which is such a bad attitude because we create poverty. It isn't that poor people are there and will always be with us. It's that our policies allow poverty to exist. But anyways, inequality has not always been with us. Not like now. And 4000 BC is a drop in the bucket of our species' at least 300,000 years of existence. So inequality, especially to the extent to which we're experiencing it now, is a pretty modern thing. And what I mean by this is that throughout history and all of prehistory, it would have been literally physically impossible for a handful of men, so people today like Elon Musk, to amass fortunes that have a value that's like hundreds of billions of times greater than that of the average wealth of a person on Earth or in their community. I mean, it just was not physically, financially possible before.
I mean, not like inequality like right now, but I would argue there hasn't been any sort of large-scale equitable social system that we know of in recorded history, much as I would like to buy into the Bronze Age matriarchy pseudo-histories.
So, one interesting thing to come out of studying inequality back into prehistory is that it turns out it's really hard to quantitatively track it back over thousands, much less tens of thousands of years, because inequality expresses itself so differently depending on the level of productivity of a society. And so, you can come up with things like Gini coefficients and all this and that, but sometimes even comparing a Gini coefficient from one century to another is comparing apples and oranges. So, what is inequality? So, inequality requires a surplus of something beyond the minimum needed to keep people alive. And this surplus needs to be storable. So, it needs to be something like grain. It also needs people that are prepared to have that surplus grain shared unevenly. And I mean that on both ends, both on the grabbing more than their fair share end, like the land or other property owning elite, and the grabbed from end, like the farmers. Although the grabbed from end generally lacks the political, cultural, or military power to retain their fair share of the productivity of what is produced, of the surplus, sorry, excuse me. And so, what this means in practice is that the greater the surplus that a society creates, the greater the amount of inequality that it can sustain. Prior to the development of agriculture and the domestication of grains and the establishment of permanent settlements and things like warehouses, inequality barely existed. There just wasn't anything to hoard. A bigger, meaner person may have been able to demand a greater share of the tubers that had gotten dug out of the ground that week, or a greater say in the decision making. But before agriculture opened the doors to a storable surplus, inequality couldn't really grow greater than that.
That inequality equation makes sense to me, but I would like it noted that it is a terrible equation. It's my observed experience that humans are wired to just want more stuff, to stave off the possibility of starvation. Like, I think it might be an evolution thing, but we really need to work on cultivating our sense of what is enough.
So in defense of the historian, like if you want to at least try to compare things back through time, you got to come up with some sort of way of doing that and of measuring inequality, even if it's flawed. But as far as the as far as what you've just said, yeah, no matter how much sociobiologists love to tell stories, you can't just say a priori that such a behavior, like wanting to have it all, is an evolution thing. And I don't even think all societies necessarily have this urge. I mean, it really could be something we learned and wove into our cultures since early agrarian times. Because you could starve if your crop failed and you didn't have some backup food squirreled away somewhere. And I mean, seriously, I don't think any of us really truly fathom the extent to which our thinking and our cultures and our assumptions and our vocabulary and our sayings are and our understanding of how everything works are really agrarian in nature. I mean, we really definitely don't think like hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I have listened to so many popular science books about the brain and our animal instincts that at this point it must have filtered in from somewhere.
Oh, sure. These are totally the stories that have seeped into the overarching narrative that we use to understand ourselves and our situations. I
Hmm.
think it's good to remember that agriculture has been a long learning process for humanity. In the beginning, we had no clue, and hardly any domesticated crops, hardly any domesticated animals, and little more than some primitive tools and our own sweaty backs. Back at that kind of beginning of agriculture, when we weren't very good at it, and we didn't have things like combine harvesters powered by fossil fuels, societies were maybe only able to produce 5% more than subsistence in a good year. If that surplus came in the form of something that could be stored, like, say, a cereal grain, then the elite could only extract that extra 5% for themselves. If they took more than that and kept up that extraction of more than the surplus, a good chunk of the society would starve to death. So, that's not a sustainable state of affairs.
Yeah, not at all.
Right? Today we have much more surplus than 5% that can be seized. And so, even if most people aren't living exactly at subsistence level, the distribution of wealth and income is hugely more unequal now than it would have been at the dawn of agriculture. So, it's a
That's
complicated concept, inequality.
So again, I feel like we need to teach a class in schools or have like some sort of official report that comes out every few years that scientifically proves how much enough is in the context of the society that one lives in. Say you lived in Canada in 1998 and you didn't have kids or health problems, X amount of money per year would be enough for you. Like to live on, to like buy groceries, to go on some vacations, that sort of stuff, to, help the local economy or whatever. Like if you had a family, that number would go up or something like that.
That sounds very coercive. But there is no answer anyway to the how much is enough question. I mean, we've been searching for that answer for as long as we've had the luxury of the time and energy to ask the question, how much is enough? What does one need to lead a good life?
Mhm.
Religion, philosophy, psychology, politics, economics, teenagers earnestly pondering the meaning of life, founders of communes, people driving around with bumper stickers, always on nice cars, reading Live Simply so that others may simply live. They've all tried and mostly failed to answer the question of how much is enough. You end up with an answer like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And all those people who study what the minimum income it is you need to be happy, or the income beyond which brings no increase in health and happiness.
I mean, I don't think my system is the answer. I just sort of pulled it out of my butt right now. In fact, it was more of a tongue-in-cheek example than anything else. All I know for sure is that a one-size-fits-all solution will never work because everyone is different. But it would be better to address our cluelessness and evolutionary wiring than completely ignoring it, which is kind of what we're doing now on a large scale.
I mean, it's tricky because you don't want to be authoritarian, right? And say you can't earn any more money than this. I mean, it's a tricky thing. I'm
Why
sure you
not?
could,
Why not be
because
authoritarian?
then you end up with like Stalin and lots of people dying. To get back to the book, which has summed up the history of inequality, at least qualitatively as opposed to quantitatively. So, our domestication of plants and animals enabled us to accumulate and store surpluses. As we got better at that over the last 12 to 15,000 years, we developed social norms to define who has the rights to these assets, the surpluses, and we created the possibility for people to pass the assets they'd accumulated, so, their wealth and their property, on to their descendants. Left unchecked, for instance, by tools such as progressive rates of taxation, wealth taxes, and inheritance taxes, over time, wealth tends to distill itself into the pockets of the few at the expense of everyone else. And that's
Mm.
just simply how any unbalanced system will evolve over time. It's the whole thing. Money makes money, and when you've got more of it in your pocket, then you have the power to grab more of it than other people. Because you can make investments that yield returns, you can buy property for which you can receive rent, that sort of thing. You can earn lots more money without having to do very much work.
Hmm.
In principle, in societies over the last 12,000 years since we got into growing things, institutions could have prevented inequality from growing. They could have rebalanced the distribution of resources and the products of labor. Again, see taxes, unions, minimum wage laws, rent
Right.
control. Yeah. In practice, the opposite happened almost without exception.
Mm.
Down through history, almost everywhere in the world where people turned to agriculture, the states that formed did not help stop the selfish, Machiavellian, and greedy, not to mention psychopathic, from seizing and hoarding more than their fair share. The states that formed were not egalitarian, but highly competitive forms of organization with steep hierarchies of power and skewed access to income and wealth. In other words, political inequality didn't just reinforce income inequality, it encouraged its further development.
Wow. I kind of get that ragey bit because I'm pissed off now. Because when Scheidel puts it like that, it seems so incredibly simple for those in the right place to just rebalance things a little bit so that inequality isn't so much of an issue. But they chose not to.
The situation doesn't even get better as you move into modern times. As Scheidel points out, in pre modern agrarian societies in history, there was a lot of corruption, extortion, and plunder enacted by the powerful against everybody else. And that was state sponsored, right? Via land grants, or the right to collect taxes, or the right to have feudal estates, or extract whatever you could from your peasants.
Right.
So, as a result, most pre modern societies grew as unequal as they could get without becoming unsustainable in the long run. So really for most of the last 12,000 years, people have been stuck getting by at more or less subsistence level, while the wealthy and powerful were able to appropriate the entire surplus that those societies were producing. This was true in Europe, this was true in Babylon, this was true in Imperial China, basically everywhere agrarian during the centuries of low capital output and minimal economic growth. Again, so most of the last roughly 12,000 years since humanity turned to agriculture and quote unquote civilization. In modern, less overtly corrupt times, the state has protected and promoted inequality by strengthening property rights and protecting inherited wealth.
Those sneaky bastards.
Ah, you mean civilized bastards.
Okay, before I rage spiral, let's get back to methodology. Can you go through the quote unquote four horsemen of leveling? Like, I'm curious to know what is meant by mass mobilization warfare as opposed to, say, normal garden variety war.
So, mass mobilization war is war that mobilizes more than 2% of the total population to fight in it. So, World War I and World War II qualify. So, just to talk about World War II here, in addition to costing 60 million people their lives worldwide, left Europe in ruins, infrastructurally and economically, and involved the drafting of anywhere from, say, in the USA, it was 10% of the male population, and in places like France and Germany, it was 40% of the male population into the armed forces. Okay, so overall, that turns out to be more like 4 to 5% of the total population. So, in short, mass mobilization warfare is the sort of war where everybody is involved, one way or another, and most people have had to make sacrifices and may have lost an awful lot, including loved ones, possibly also their dwelling, and if you're a soldier returning with less than your full suite of limbs, your occupation or ability to work at all.
Okay, so this mass mobilization warfare, that's a more recent development.
Prior to World War I and II, wars tended to only mobilize, say, 1 to 1.5% of a state's total population. With this slightly lower level of mobilization, you don't get massive economic leveling as a result of the warfare. So the rich
Oh.
of a devastated state that's been in a fight with some other state, they might lose their wealth and become more equal to their fellow, yeah, either citizens or I suppose former citizens at this point because they've been conquered. But the riches seized tend to end up in the coffers of the elites of the winning state. So that actually drives an increase in inequality in the conquering state. So you don't really have any net leveling event. Okay. But during these such total wars, these world wars, so much gets destroyed. The rich lose much of their fortunes to bombardment on all sides, most sides,
Uh-huh.
or to a decrease in the value of various assets, or for various other reasons. Then after the end of the war, because everyone has to put up with rationing and has sent sons or brothers off to be soldiers, never mind all the women who served in what capacities they were allowed.
Hmm.
And so many normal people have lost their homes or livelihoods. The mood on the ground is to tax the hell out of the rich to get society back on its feet again. Because everyone has sacrificed. The normal people, more so generally than the rich. The rich should also now sacrifice, and both hardship and prosperity should be more equally shared.
I think that's a very reasonable conclusion to come to.
And it's why, if you look at the average top rates of income tax across a group of 20 countries, you'll see that these top tax rates jumped, at first in response to World War I, from below 5% at the beginning of the 20th century to a peak of well over 80% in 1950, just a few years after the end of World War II. I mean, like in some countries, it was like up to 95%, I think, like in the UK or something.
Mm.
It was by modern standards, you're like, holy cow.
Mm.
Because now is more like, capital gains is more like 15%. So all of these rates have been declining ever since, as our sense of need for fairness across society has declined, as the experience of the war years recedes from living memory. Basically, it's just a rat race now, and the winner takes all, or at least as much as they can, and then they don't have to pay very many taxes on it because rich people don't pay much taxes. And then we worship these people. We call them geniuses as opposed to just selfish jerks. We buy their autobiographies. We hang on to their every proclamation. We buy their products and we vote them into the presidency.
Ugh, that's the opposite of what we want to happen.
Right? And so in terms of the impact this has had over the long run, this tendency towards peace and prosperity to live to inequality, you can actually look at one of the figures he has in the book is the qualitative change in inequality, like there's no numbers on it, right? It's just a squiggle. In the USA since 1650, so since before the War for Independence in the 1770s. So it's been rising steadily since 1650, inequality in the US.
Mhm.
You'd think the Civil War would have done a lot, but it actually didn't really. Some rich people lost assets, but then they were also, as in, slaves, human beings that they owned, but they were
Mm.
compensated for this somewhat, and and then there were also people in the North who ended up capitalizing on this. So overall, inequality in the U.S. didn't really go down because of the Civil War.
Mm.
World War I caused a brief dip, but after World War II, inequality plummeted for several decades down to a low in 1970 that was almost about as low as it had been back in 1650.
Mm.
But since then, since, all we're no longer taxing the hell out of rich people,
Mhm.
inequality has increased and we're almost back to where we were before the Great Depression struck, followed shortly thereafter by World War II. So really, like, we've lost all the gains we made at this point. Inequality is basically back up to as bad as it has ever been, or worse.
This is making me wonder about our assumptions that states were ever supposed to combat inequality in the first place. Like, I don't think that any state has ever before the US, followed by modern Europe and post-colonial nations, set out to deliberately recuperate the rights of one group of people after another. Like, sure, there's examples like the Ottoman Empire, and even going back to Alexander the Great, where once a city was conquered, they were allowed to keep their own religion and customs as long as they paid tribute to their conquering overlords. And that's not equality so much as just common sense when it comes to trying to hold together an empire full of people who have very good reason not to like you very much.
If you believe that the state, especially in a modern Western liberal democracy, is supposed to be there for the people and not the other way around. I mean, that's what I always assumed it was supposed to be like. People vote for their representatives who represent their interests. That's how modern Western liberal democracy is sold to us. And one of our most important interests is not to keep losing our increasingly declining share of the GDP to the rich and powerful.
Yeah, that's the line we're all raised with, but I also wonder, I think that's got to be a really recent development. I mean, I'm no historian, but my remembrance of, like history classes is that no states really, like started out with a mandate to serve the people, except for the US.
Well, I mean, it's a post-Enlightenment thing, right? Most states were founded before the Enlightenment in
Oh,
Europe
right.
and et cetera and so forth in Asia and all of these things. Um,
Uh,
but there is kind of always this idea that rulers should be, kindly and, like good King Wenceslas, for example, or whatever from the Christmas Carol, who's lauded for being kind to the poor and
yeah, I think that's
right. There's
propaganda.
propaganda that stretches way back in time. And we're still being fed the Kool-Aid here.
Most rich people have to, or like people who are in power have to be guilted slash shamed into like actually, like being nice to people who aren't as rich as they are.
And I think rich people think they deserve what they've got. They think they've earned it and they don't want to, these people are very oriented on money. They aren't going to pay it, give it away in taxes, right? They'll find ways not to pay taxes, whether that
Hmm.
involves buying politicians or
Yeah,
hiding money in tax shelters and anyways.
yeah.
Anyways, let's move on to the second of Walter Scheidel's Four Horsemen of Inequality, which is transformative revolution. By this, he doesn't mean civil war, which appears anyway to enhance inequality when already wealthy elites make off with the best of the spoils of the war.
Mm.
He doesn't even mean something like the French Revolution of the late 1700s, in which the people stormed the Bastille, abolished feudalism, deposed Louis XVI, and chopped the heads off of more than 10,000 people, many of them nobility, but quite a lot of them the commoners that they employed. So, in other words, not rich people. The short answer here is that the French Revolution wasn't anywhere near violent enough in terms of dispatching the rich to have had much of a leveling effect. The slightly longer short answer is that the whole picture is muddled further because the French Revolution was immediately followed by a return to monarchy and the paying of reparations to those who had lost their riches.
I don't
But
think I
that is
remember that part from Les Mis.
I've never read that, but yeah, yeah, fiction. But that is also part of the answer, right? So if the social support wasn't there for maintaining the leveling that at least got started during the French Revolution and, enhanced a little bit by the guillotine. Um, and so, right, the French Revolution did not ultimately result in much of the way of leveling on either the short or the long term.
Yeah, we'll just add a little guillotine in there for a little sprinkle of like flavor. Sorry, I just love how you said
Oh,
that.
sprinkle, sprinkle. That is not a nice imagery when
Ugh.
combined with the guillotine. So, what this Walter Scheidel is talking about in terms of transformative revolution is stuff on the scale of the communist revolutions that kicked off in 1917 in Russia and continued to expand throughout various parts of the world until about 1950. The leveling associated with this massive reorganization of economic systems and power structures and, everything was driven by the murder or deaths by hunger of tens of millions of people and the incredibly violent redistribution of land, much of which was collectivized. Inequality plummeted amongst those who survived. Okay, but interesting. That didn't mean that the survivors were suddenly all better off, right? You can decrease inequality by lowering the top and raising the bottom, or just by dropping everyone down to the bottom. Because it
Mm.
is possible for everyone to be equally poor and equally hungry because the economy has crashed along with rates of food production.
Morbid, but if there are less mouths to feed, there's more to go around, right?
Well, but what I'm saying is that there wasn't more to go around
Mm.
because agriculture just when they collectivized, like it just everything went south. Yeah,
Hmm.
and central planning also it's very disastrous for food production. People start fudging statistics and yeah, the market actually has some useful aspects to it. But anyways, in these communist revolutions, the people at the top fell further than everyone else, I mean, except for the super elite few who retained power. But that didn't mean that the bottom rose up.
Mm.
So just take the communist revolution in Russia that took what was an empire under the control of the Tsar and turned it into an imperial socialist state. This required the abdication and later murder of the Tsar, the takeover of the government by the Bolsheviks, the seizure of land from the church and the landed gentry, and its redistribution to peasants, and then later its collectivization. It involved a civil war. It took the torture, execution, and murder or starvation of, again, tens of millions of people, and the imprisonment of 18 million people in forced labor camps, the dreaded Gulag. Also, that ordinary people and previously rich people alike could have pretty much equally as little as everyone else for the next more than half a century. That's the level of revolution that it takes to drive notable leveling that persists for, yeah, at least a few decades. The process ain't pretty, and the result isn't actually that great necessarily either. And it still doesn't even last forever. I mean, what are a couple decades on the scale of human history?
I think that's definitely part of why people aren't doing much in the way of revolution these days in the West, even though things are really not great. We're all too scarred still from the 20th century to take up arms against our, governments and stuff like that because nobody has a plan for what's going to happen afterwards that doesn't involve all of this horrible suffering, and nobody wants that.
And now look at the weapons we have.
I
With
don't
with
like looking at the weapons we have,
I mean,
Christina. It
I
makes me
think
very sad.
this also totally changes the equation. You can't just come out there with pitchforks and muskets, right? You've got
Mm,
drones and tanks, and you've got stuff that normal people don't have.
yeah.
And so revolution also isn't just very practical anymore. You're not going to succeed at it. Or you end up in a situation where a bunch of jerks with more weapons than everybody else then just prevents a nice society from developing in the aftermath of revolution. Yeah, it's a very, very tricky, iffy, risky undertaking.
I
And
think
yeah, 20th century. Yeah,
And I think
that
I think that's
who
why
wants a
most
revolution
people's
like that?
imagination of revolution goes like from like I'm sad to let's topple the state to
Let's watch the Humber
question
Games
mark. Yeah,
to
exactly.
post-apocalypse. Let's overthrow the dystopia yeah, let's dream about
Yeah.
overthrowing the dystopia.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean that was Suzanne Collins's whole point was that like even just overthrowing the dystopia isn't enough because you're just gonna end up reinstalling a similar dystopia if you don't have a concrete plan of what to do afterwards or any sort of way to deal with all the different variables in society that are going to come to plague you.
I only read the first book, but I've probably more or less seen all the movies. The trilogy is a trilogy.
Is
And
it is it trilogy? Well, there's actually four movies because the last one, remember,
oh yeah, it
like
got
they were doing
split.
that for a while where they would split the last of a
Yeah.
trilogy into two movies. So yeah.
Anyways, I was very impressed with the ending of the final movie
Mhm.
where, they all go back home. Okay, so it's annoying that Katniss just becomes ordinary. You see them there, they're sitting in this beautiful sunny field, they've got little babies, and then you're sort of like, oh yeah, okay, so this is why they've done it, right? They have fought for a
Yeah.
better world for their children to and for themselves to live in. And so I was like, oh, I thought that was a nice message for that to end on. I don't know if the book ended that way.
Uh,
Presumably it did, but
no, it doesn't. The book, that was a very Hollywood ending. The book doesn't have a Hollywood ending. The book is a
okay.
lot more realistic and terrible. So,
Okay,
um,
I'll have to
yeah,
read more than just the first one then. So,
it's
I mean,
very
because she
much
can write.
commentary.
I was impressed. So, yeah, so that brings us to Scheidel's third horseman, which is state failure. And we're
Mm,
not talking piddly little state failure that allows an elite minority to behave unchecked at their most horribly greedy, grabby, and corrupt because they're the warlords. But state failure is big and as bad as it gets. I mean, really, it's like go big or go home here. In fact, it's
mm,
sort of go biggest or go home because collapse is what things like war and revolutions lead to when they really go all the way. And ditto for catastrophic climate change. There are tons of ways in which the breakdown of a state destroys opportunities for the elite to enrich themselves, which is kind of a staggering damnation of civilization.
Hmm.
Right, so the breakdown of a bigger state into smaller entities reduces the amount of resources that can be hoarded at the top by a small number of elites. Without the
Hmm.
structure of a state, it's hard to make money with investments in business or by controlling trade. It's also hard to make money via graft, bribes, and corruption. Another way in which state failure reduces inequality is that the poor can't lose very much in terms of their income without dropping below subsistence level, i.e., dying, and the rich have further to fall, and so they can fall further. So, in other
Hmm.
words, you don't so much need gains at the bottom to reduce inequality. You can simply do this leveling through attrition at the top.
Ah, so cut off the head of the snake. I don't know. Sounds very anarchist to me. So, but what I'm getting from
Well,
all of
but
this,
this is why people are so afraid of violent anarchy, right?
well, yeah, yeah, exactly. And I
This
mean,
whole smash the state thing, right?
yeah, yeah, which was definitely part of the whole like punk anarchist ethos back in the 80s. I think anarchy has
Oh, it's
softened
become much
somewhat.
kinder, gentler now. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know that much about anarchism, but when I became anarchist curious, I read some essays by Emma Goldman, and I was like, oh my God, this is horrible.
I
Why does
mean,
anyone think this is a good idea? So her writings are very, very propagandistic and very strongly advocating the use of violence, murder, assassination, all sorts of things to incite people to revolt against the state. With this idea that the end justifies the means, and it doesn't matter how many people suffer and die.
when did Emma Goldman live? She was like,
A very violent time for anarchism in the early
ah,
20th century. The
okay.
Molotov cocktail throwing. Let's assassinate President McKinley time.
Okay. I mean, I would hope that's not what
In
people
the
have to
Russian
resort.
Revolution
Uh,
period of anarchism, right?
yeah, considering how bloody that was, you just finished describing how terrible things were when people attempt to start revolutions. So
Right.
that
I mean,
totally makes sense.
it involved not just genocide, but classicide, right? So it was a
Hmm.
very bloody revolution. So,
Hmm.
and the anarchists pitched in. The Bolsheviks won, but the anarchists were a faction that participated. So,
And also, I mean, like the definition of anarchy, like, I mean, show me an anarchist and you'll get a definition of anarchy, you know? Like
yeah.
it's
But most
very
people,
small.
to the normal person on the street, anarchy is not a state you want to have. And I
Hmm.
don't mean like state, but a condition.
Mm.
Because
Yeah.
to most people, having it's just lawlessness and violence, and the nastiest person with the biggest guns gets whatever they want. That's how most people see
Yeah.
anarchism or anarchy.
Yeah. But what I'm getting from what you're telling me here, from what Scheidel says, civilization is basically a system that's made by the rich to ensure that they keep enriching themselves at the expense of others, which is super grim.
Yeah, but not surprising when you think about how civilization must have come about with like the people who wanted more, like taking power over everybody else, the little warlords or the little leaders or whatever. But I mean, this seems to be the conclusion that several historians have come to these days. They seem to be trying to tell us with the books they write and stuff like that. Don't believe the propaganda. Civilization hasn't been good for most of us. Okay, it's brought us a couple of good things like, modern medicine and vaccines and stuff like that, but it's been really great for the greedy, the psychopathic, the narcissistic, and the Machiavellian, which I guess I would call the dark triad plus one. I don't know. Anyways,
Hmm. I mean, it seems like you have another group of four. I don't know if they're horsemen of the apocalypse or whatever, but like, you put them together and I mean, they're a
you're
dark
every world
harbinger of
leader we
some.
have today,
Yeah. Well,
right? I
I
won't
wouldn't
name
say
names. I'm
every world leader. I would
Well, the
say
ones who are on the
definitely the
news
ones
every
who are
night.
in the news. Yeah, yeah.
The ones who
So,
are causing all the problems.
yes.
The
Well, I
one
mean, like that's the thing. The ones who are not terrible are the ones who aren't making the news because the news is obsessed with terrible people.
Well,
Um,
anyways, that is a whole other topic.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
we
I
can move
want you to
on
talk
to.
about the last horseman because that's the one that is like that's the one that resonates with the biblical horseman of the apocalypse. Like it's plague, you know? Like that is so classic.
Yeah, I mean, because mostly the biblical apocalypse horsemen, they're a little bit more abstract.
Mm.
But anyway, so the final horseman of leveling is plague. And we're not talking on the scale of COVID-19 here. And we're probably not even talking on the level of the Spanish flu in 1918.
Oh
We're
wow.
talking on the scale of the Black Death that killed about 50 million people between 1346 and 1353. So that was about half of Europe's population at that time.
Yikes.
And the Black Death refers specifically to this particular pandemic of bubonic plague, right? So there have been numerous bubonic plague pandemics. The first one was the plague of Justinian, which hit the Mediterranean area and the Near East, so mainly the Byzantine Empire and the Iranian Sasanian Empire, I don't quite know how to say that, in 541 to 549 AD.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about that.
Right, so they've only just recently confirmed that this was plague because they were able to get the DNA of the bacterium out of
Oh,
the bones of
okay.
some of the victims.
Okay, yeah. I know like it was like colloquially called plague, but I wasn't really sure if it was this like when you say plague, what do you mean by
So
that, you
plague
know?
normally refers to the what's caused by this bacterium Yersinia pestis, so the cause
Mm.
of the Black Death.
Okay.
But the Black Death is very specifically the second outbreak of bubonic plague, which occurred
Mm.
800 years later, so between 1346 and 1353. And the third plague pandemic, this bubonic
Mm.
plague pandemic, began in 1855 in Yunnan, China, and it spread to every inhabited continent.
No, sorry. I just feel like I haven't really heard of that one, like a
Yeah,
third bubonic plague.
yeah, but it existed. It didn't get much press, so it only killed 15 million people, and it required more than 100 years. So it wasn't as intense as the other ones. So we had more
Just
hygienic
kind of happening in the
conditions.
background. They were like,
Um, so
well, Sally's got the plague, whatever.
so I think the worst parts were really confined. The worst outbreaks were probably confined to like China and India. So it killed 15
Oh,
million people, mainly in China and India, before it came to an end in 1960.
oh wow.
Yeah. And
Wow.
by then we have antibiotics and stuff like that now.
Huh.
And so that was the point when the outbreak stopped being so widespread that it was no longer a pandemic.
Okay.
Right? And the plague is still with us. A couple people get it every year, but we don't have outbreaks, much less
Hmm.
epidemics, much
Yeah.
less pandemics.
Like uncontrolled, sort of like, ripping through the population like wildfire, like
So I think,
COVID-19.
yes, exactly. And involving a large portion of the human population and being present in a lot of different places, not just in one local area. So the big plague pandemic was that second one. It was that Black Death that wiped out about half of the population of, not just Europe, but actually Eurasia over the course of 4 years. It killed so many people that it caused a massive shortage of laborers, for example, in Europe. There was such a shortage, it was hard to hire anyone to do work, like farm or whatever, for even three times the previous going rate for labor, like tailors and bakers and like everybody, all the work that needed to be done. Suddenly
Mhm.
had to pay people more than a subsistence wage. Meanwhile, so many people had died, property prices and rents that could be earned by owning property plummeted. The rich are no longer raking in a lot of income, and
Mhm.
everyone else is able to say, hey, you got to pay me three times more than you used to pay me. So that's a pretty serious leveling event. Okay.
Yeah.
This did not go down well with the
Oh.
people in power. So local authorities started passing laws making it punishable to pay workers so well.
Oh, what?
They made it illegal for workers to demand such high wages. They're like, sorry, you have to be paid what you used to be paid, or you're going to go to prison.
Ugh, that's
Yeah.
incredibly despicable.
Yeah,
Oh,
civilization is in it for the wealthy, And
oh,
they were
that's
like, how
awful.
dare you destabilize society by demanding more than subsistence wages?
Honestly, we're kind of seeing that a little bit in the wake of COVID-19. It's like, why do you want living wages? At the same time, it's like, why are there all these missing people from the workforce? Why does nobody want to work anymore? And it's like, well, they're all
Because they're
dead.
lazy.
It's no, it's not because they're lazy, it's because they're dead.
Selfish. Because they'd rather be welfare queens. I mean, we've got all sorts of propaganda to deal with this rather than actually
Like
problem.
I don't know, did everybody just collectively forget that like tons of people died? Like anyway.
I think we've just been brainwashed. Anyways, right. Okay, but it gets worse because, the laws weren't really that effective. That's how much power labor had because of its scarcity. So at the same time, the authorities in the church started to try to shame workers into
Oh.
working for their previous just barely above subsistence wages by reminding people that they needed to accept their God-given lot in life, that it was selfish and a sin to try to rise above it. They were going to destabilize society with their greed. If you came from a poor working class family, then it was your duty to society to work hard for crappy wages. Even certain foods and items of clothing were banned to you by law and custom, even if you could afford to buy them because they were above your station in life.
I feel like the Reformation didn't happen then and there only due to the fact that there just weren't enough people to stage a mass religious schism.
What do I know about religion aside from, next to nothing? But does Catholicism preach? I mean, aside from the meek shall inherit the earth, so sit down, shut up, be quiet, and get back to work, that it's a sin to try to rise above your station in life?
No, I mean, like, technically not the faith itself, but corrupt religious officials would definitely misuse their powers to convince people that that is what the Bible actually teaches. So, one of the big points of the Reformation was printing the Bible in the common language instead of the church Latin, so that people could actually read it and start picking apart what the Bible actually says and what the Catholic Church clergy were telling people in order to control them. And that's a whole other different discussion. But yeah, basically, there was sort of a rule of religious law because people just had no idea what the Bible actually said.
How much has that situation changed really could be a whole other discussion.
Oh, yeah.
But the Black Death, that second plague pandemic, was really the big one for a plague causing leveling, like in human history. In
Hmm.
other places that had lesser plagues, because, not all plague outbreaks were pandemics, and right, yeah, not all disease outbreaks were bubonic plague, even though we like to call everything plague. Anyways, at the times of these lesser outbreaks, however, the elite remained united and organized enough to prevent wages from rising and inequality from falling. Because these people want everything and it doesn't matter to them that they're impoverishing everyone else. So, I mean, we see this today even without pandemic with people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg, and so on and so on and so forth. All this move fast and break things crap, which really just means, ignore the laws that protect people's rights, especially if they get in the way of you making all the profit. And people can't see that. I'm just like, I don't understand how people don't see that.
Hmm. I mean, it's pretty grim when it's all laid out stark on the page like that. I mean, when you're in a situation, there are all sorts of variables to consider that feed into decisions and sort of obscure your clear vision of what's going on. But when it's written out like that, there's a way more stark answer to, do you want inequality to rise or fall? And it's really disappointing and enraging to see that most people in charge answered rise, obviously.
I don't even know if they consciously know that's what they're doing when they help their rich friends and supporters make more money and pay less taxes. I think there's this like, oh my God, we don't want to have a recession, much less a depression. I think they're actually afraid on some level of tanking the economy and they just making really bad decisions because of that. But they're also, who has their ear? People with money, people with power, lobbyists who are paid with people by people with money and people with power. But to go
Mhm.
back to the rant I wasn't quite finished with. So, my understanding of the history of Western civilization, at least, was not previously one of the law and God will smite you down for trying to rise above your station.
Mhm.
As were sort of like, yeah, that's the caste system, where if you try to escape your lot in life, you'll be punished severely in your next life, reincarnated as some miserable little life form like, I don't know, cockroach, whatever. But maybe I was just not paying attention. Maybe the whole exciting thing about European settlers pouring into the New World is that a lot of them were trying to escape that trap.
Oh
They
yeah.
were heading out for an quote unquote empty continent where they could pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and create their own fortunes. Yeah, so part of this is a post-Enlightenment thing. And part of this is, yeah, obviously my view has been colored by American mythology and propaganda that I was raised on. I cannot imagine living in a society where there are rules against you rising above your situation. I mean, having the game rigged against you is one thing. I mean, we all know about that, right? But we still think that in theory, you could still succeed if if you hustle enough and have enough grit or whatever, or get a lucky break, and if God likes you enough to shine prosperity down upon you.
Uh-huh. And they say it's not a theocracy.
Well,
Yeah, in my very amateurish historian but PhD educated affect theorist mind, violent revolt against such a repressive society only really seems to happen like this level revolution. Second, it was that the second horseman of the apocalypse or
uh,
sibling? Whatever. That violent revolution
yeah, it was.
only
It was
really
number
seems
two.
to happen when people either have a surplus of emotion, like they get mad enough and frustrated enough, at the same time as a deficit of other emotions. So like just not caring about the consequences. And that can be a pretty toxic mixture and lead to people doing a lot of things that they regret because they're angry and don't care about what happens in the future, just in that moment.
From my limited understanding of the Russian Revolution, part of what kicked it off is that in World War One, you have all these soldiers dying on on what is the eastern front of the war. The Red Army was becoming more and more and more demoralized. And the people had been upset about feudalism in Russia for a while, and there were these ideas that the peasants deserve to own the land and all this stuff. And you had all this kind of simmering all at the same time. And so what kind of kicked everything off is that the people in power in Russia thought, well, we got to get the czar to resign. We got to establish some sort of provisional government, and then maybe that will quell this disillusionment before we have the army revolt.
Right, before it
And
gets
so that's what you're talking about there. Also,
yeah.
people also need not, they need to be pushed so far that they are no longer worrying about what they have to lose. So right now,
Yeah, exactly.
like the middle class is not rising up against Donald Trump in the US because they're still like, yeah, we have all this to lose, and so far we are not having anything taken away from us.
Yeah, so there's that they have that surplus of emotion, like they're getting mad enough, but there's not at the same time that deficit. It has the caring about the consequences hasn't been reduced enough because there
Yep.
are still major consequences to their way of life, right? So
Right,
it's
because
this,
they're still being relatively served by the system, even though they're losing freedoms right, left, and center, haven't quite grasped it yet.
yeah. So we see all this indictment of protests as like violent and like violent like
Rabble
uh,
rousers,
rabble
stupid
rouser. Yeah,
hippies,
yeah, exactly. When people are just pointing out some very,
Antifa,
yeah. I mean, I feel like people are pointing out some very unjust
propaganda. It's a
way
way
of,
to defuse the power of protest. You get
yeah,
people to
yeah.
be like, oh, those college students,
So violent, so, so
so
unable to
clueless.
understand things are just not that simple. I mean, it depends on how you define violence. Like, does Scheidel talk his terminology at all? Like, I think I might have said this in a previous podcast, but there's a difference between violence against inanimate objects, such as buildings or cars, and violence against living beings, such as humans or animals.
Oh, he's talking about violence that involves a huge chunk of society dying.
Ah,
Not like, a few people burning down a couple of banks of America or anything like that. And the violence that involves massive numbers of people dying or losing most of their assets or both is inflicted by these cataclysmic forces, right? This mass mobilization warfare, this transformative revolution, plague, and state failure, right? So
mm.
by murder, genocide, classicide, disease, famine, and other fun things like that.
That's interesting because I think in the way that the media is taking up the word violent right now, we're not really making any sort of distinction between what one person thinks of as nonviolent is not the same as what another person might think. So, like, for example, what might be understood as a nonviolent protest by one person can be construed as a very violent one by another. Like, there's a difference between protests that are violent and protests that are a violation of laws, private property, etc. Like, thus, a protest where a statue of a historical figure is pulled down can be called violent, but it didn't actually hurt anyone, except that it violated the law against
Yeah, that
defacing
ain't violent.
statues or whatever. Yeah,
That's an abuse of the
that's
word
not
violent.
violent. And yet, that's something that might be seen as violent and scary by some people for whom transgressing those laws does not make any sense. Laws are extremely tenuous and subject to change, and often they're positioned to keep inequities in place rather than to address them because they benefit the people in charge, as we've been talking about. So, in a way, a protest that is not a violation is not a very effective one at all. And so, if we're using that understanding, the question is whether for a protest to work, should it be violent? I would say, yeah. In that
So
sense,
this isn't
be at least a violation.
so this isn't really what is being addressed by the book. I mean, there's really no room for tomato here. We're talking mass death, massive losses, mass suffering. It's not about protest. It's about everything that was previously stable imploding for one or several of various reasons. Yes, one of those reasons can be people rising up to the level of murdering a massive proportion of their fellow human beings in war or revolution. But the event has to be so big that the result isn't that an elite minority manages to steal more wealth for themselves, but that wages rise and wealth gets redistributed, which hardly ever happened in human history. It only happened after these extraordinarily violently catastrophic events.
Mm. So I think that picking apart the language that people use to frame protests is important because that invocation of violent protest is something that gets people thinking about this sort of like mass leveling and like violence against other humans on a mass scale. So if, say, one believes that protests are violent in the way that they seriously threaten human life, then one might feel justified in, say, calling the army out to deal with protesters, and that action may be seen as justifiable in the court of public opinion because these protesters are violent, no matter whether or not they're actually harming humans or just harming property. If you understand protesters' violence to be in the realm of the symbolic, however, as violations of laws and policies in order to point out their corrupt nature, maybe there wouldn't be quite so much support for a trigger-happy army response, you know?
Well, I'm not sure there is much support for a trigger happy army response at the moment, but that's not stopping them from bringing in the army. But something that remains in the realm of protest is working on a much, much lower order of magnitude than a true leveling event, right? Protest is targeting people's attitudes, it's knocking down statues, or it's aiming to drive some changes in a couple of laws, or, it's just going on strike for better working conditions, which, okay, yeah, is technically leveling, um, but like I said, even the French Revolution didn't manage to drive a notable or long-lasting change in inequality, even if it did change the identity of some of the people who held the wealth and power in France.
Hmm. So what about the future? Because at least in principle, we could learn from history. And now that Scheidel has demonstrated that civilization only enhances inequality, or it has historically, do we stand a chance of reversing inequality without the kind of like violence, true violence, that threatens life and limb?
Scheidel's thoughts on the future of leveling can be summed up in one word: grim. He doesn't think we have it in us to redistribute wealth without a violent impetus or a violent fight back against that attempt at redistribution. I mean, if we've never once managed it so far in all of human history to any, lasting and extensive extent, I think even knowing that we're doomed to have another violent episode of leveling that will be so bad for all of us, unless we all pitch together,
Mm,
I don't even think knowing that would be enough for us to get our act together and start taxing the hell out of the rich. Every time a budget needs to be balanced, or really brought slightly less insanely out of deficit spending, does any politician, in the US, for instance, other than AOC or Bernie Sanders, say, hey, let's raise taxes on the rich? Do even more ordinary people say that? No, they're all like, cut off those lazy jerks on welfare. Get rid of their Medicaid. Let's slash Social Security. Everyone's like, I don't want my tax dollars going to people who don't work. Except that nobody cares that way more of their tax dollars are going to support rich people who don't work because they're all doing fine living off of capital investments.
The irony, it's
Ah,
you.
I don't understand how people allow the wool to be pulled over their eyes. So Scheidel also has opinions as to what the next cataclysmic leveling event might or might not be. So, for instance, with drones, etc., the age of mass mobilization warfare is over, right? You're never going to have big armies fighting big armies ever again. That horseman is dead.
Oh, and he was so young too.
Yeah, live
No,
fast,
I
die
do not
young.
mourn the passing of that. That's
um,
great. Actually, that is great news.
yeah, one thing he doesn't say is that maybe climate change will take its place, or,
Oh.
just feed the state failure, social collapse horseman, right? We'll find
Yeah,
out.
I mean, that's an interesting thought because I think climate change is the reason that lies behind a lot of these four horsemen, like the horse's dam, if you will. A lot of wars, and especially like the Middle East and other places near the equator right now, have to do with climate change caused factors like drought, since they're in a rapidly warming zone or rapidly desertifying zone. So grabbing your neighboring country's land that has more water seems like a really good idea. Plague obviously can be sourced to climate change in that insects and other disease-carrying animals can expand their range as temperatures become more mild, which I am not a fan of, by the way. There's a lot of nasty bugs coming up from the US into Canada that I am very against. Anti-immigrant sentiment. Anyway, we humans can start settling former areas of wilderness that were inaccessible due to climate before, meaning that humans are coming into contact more and more with disease-carrying animals, and that diseases can like jump to humans. I mean, not to mention all those diseases that were trapped in the permafrost and the glaciers that are now released by melting.
So I think some of these fears are overblown, especially through sci-fi imagining. Like the next great plague isn't going to spring up out of the permafrost. It's going to come out of the toxic mashup of declining habitats and the crazy industrialized animal farming that we do that, does things like pack millions of chickens into a single room with little ventilation, weak animals and poop and carcasses everywhere. It's like the perfect breeding ground for bad viruses or bad bacteria to meet and swap genetic material and turn into super totally fatal, easily transmissible pathogens. Also, it's super easy for wild birds, especially little ones like sparrows, to get into these facilities, bringing all sorts of pathogens with them. I mean, this is what's going on with bird flu, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a more likely scenario, yeah. But like, I have post-apocalypse crisis brain. These things stick with me as likely scenarios still. Like, I have a plan to get every vaccine and become invincible, you know? I mean, this is a realistic thing for me.
Okay, I'm not going to tell you that one of my friend's cats died of a cancer she got because she got vaccinated too many times in the same place.
No,
It's a thing. I'm like,
don't tell me that.
poor thing was an indoor cat too, so she probably didn't need to get the rabies shot every
Ah.
second year or whatever. Anyways, that is a digression. Um, so let me be the reality to that fiction on your brain then. So okay, what do I know? Just an armchair observer here, but I don't think that any wars right now have gotten to the level of horror that would involve leveling, not to the extent that Walter Scheidel is talking about. So even in Gaza, sure, inequality in Gaza has been pretty well, leveled by now, I would guess, along with everything else, as everyone there is more or less in the same awful situation. But ultimately, the spoils will go to the global elite who are going to swoop in and seize beachfront property to build the next Trump resort and all those, other horrible ideas that have already been floated.
Excuse me while I barf.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're sharpening the knives already and wetting their, holding
Oh,
their forks
it's
or,
so
whatever. The
disgusting.
spoils will go to the conquering capitalists and their cronies, and that is the opposite of leveling. Okay?
Ugh.
When the effects of climate change start bringing down states, plural, then we'll be at that leveling event that Scheidel talks about. Or,
Mm.
when World War III breaks out, possibly
Yay.
triggered by what's going on in the Middle East and the Ukraine right now.
Mm.
Okay?
Fun.
So I think you could also argue that plague remains a possible catastrophic trigger for leveling independent of or acting in concert with climate change. Like this bird flu is a good candidate for the next pandemic. If it ever mutates in the right way to become highly lethal and easily transmissible to people through air, and if that idiot RFK Jr.'s demolition of the virus industry and USA's disease monitoring capacity makes a significant enough global dent in our ability to react to a human outbreak of the bird flu or some other emergent pathogen. To get back to the most important question, honestly, what would it take to convince most people that the super rich and enormous corporations need to pay not just the bare minimum in taxes that we currently ask of them, which they are also really good at dodging, but something closer to the 80% tax rate that would slow down the accumulation of wealth at the tippy top? What would it take for us to decide that people shouldn't be able to pass on vast fortunes to their descendants and therefore create dynasties?
So, you and our listeners probably know by now that I'm a big believer in education and giving people the tools that they need to psychologically change or grapple with change because we can't make change unless we think about it first, right? So, earlier I mentioned some sort of index that can help us to form a concept of what is enough. So, regardless of whether or not we enforce that, so maybe at first that will include income caps. At the risk of seeming too woo-woo, teaching a gratitude practice throughout grade school and high school might really help to get people used to thinking about what they have and being more satisfied with that.
Hate to say it, but good luck with that.
Yeah, I realize I'm being pretty pie in the sky with that one. But that's only one piece of the puzzle, and it's a more long-term play. I think another major piece that should be affected immediately, especially in the global north, has to be majorly curtailing the advertising industry. So ads target that evolutionary instinct or whatever for more, that need that we have for more things in a way that most of us are really weak to psychologically. Like there are products that are completely unnecessary for our way of life that are pitched to us through media, billboards, etc. constantly. Perfume, for example, completely extraneous to the human experience. We do not need it. And yet, these ads are just constantly causing our little evolutionary more sense to be stimulated and to put us into a constant state of want and feeling like we ourselves are not enough. Never mind that we do not have enough.
I think the super rich have so much money they can't spend it all, so I'm not really sure that getting rid of advertising would actually solve the inequality problem. And, also advertising, I think at this point you got to also put the social media genie back in the bottle.
I mean, considering that social media is where most ads live nowadays, hard to agree with that one.
And also people have always wanted more. Look at the Ten Commandments, for example. That predate advertising, I presume, by thousands of years. They're already saying, hey, don't covet what your neighbor has and don't steal it either.
I recently read a line in the book Martyr by Kaveh Akbar that really stuck with me, and it goes along the lines that people in America, and the West in general, truly believe that the base state of existence is happiness and that they have a right to it. And so that's the reason for widespread dissatisfaction. Whereas if you don't base your entire life around the pursuit of happiness and instead just enjoy it when it comes, a byproduct and not the end goal of life, you're much more likely to be satisfied with whatever life throws at you.
Sorry to be skeptical again, but I don't think you're going to convince people to redistributively tax the hell out of the rich to make life better for everyone by teaching people to ask what is enough and whether or not they should be pursuing happiness. You're just doing what most religions started out trying to do, and look at what ended up happening there, right? The selfish, greedy, Machiavellian bastard seized control and used organizations like the church to concentrate and protect their wealth and power.
You're right in that some people know exactly how terrible things are and still kind of choose to participate in making the world worse for the sake of their own comfort. And education isn't going to work in all circumstances like those ones. But I think if we're going to have any hope whatsoever, we need to start at least giving future generations the tools to think critically. Like, it gives me hope to see so many teachers nowadays incorporating mindfulness into their classes, along with frank discussions about history and encouraging kids to ask questions about why the world is the way that it is, and, imagining how it could be otherwise. I mean, there will always be people who choose, for whatever reason, to be terrible. I'm just hoping that we can tip the scales in the favor of that not being every person on the face of the planet in the future.
I don't know what the answer is And I also don't think anyone knows what the answer is. But I think we do need to start asking ourselves why we think the rich deserve to hoard all the money, to the point where people working two jobs can't afford to pay rent. I think we need to start asking ourselves on a widespread societal level why we've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into thinking that the poor and homeless have earned that by being lazy, by not being good enough for God to smile down upon them, by not being educated, or by being pregnant teenagers or single mothers, thuggish, gangsters, raging alcoholics, drug addicts, and all the other terrible stereotypes we have that blame people for losing the game that the rich and powerful and their political minions have rigged against them, rigged against us. So, as you can see, I have come a long way from those days when I sweetly, totally believed in the state, especially if it was left-leaning and democratic. So, damn you, or maybe bless you, Walter Scheidel.
Yes, join us on the dark side, Christina, in the humanities, where we question everything and there are no concrete answers. Ha ha ha. But I mean, for real, a humanities education doesn't actually teach you much in the way of answers, but it goes a long way towards coaxing you to ask the right kinds of questions. So, like, I would rather my solarpunk society be made up of people who can admit that they have no clue what they're doing, but they're striving to do right by their neighbors anyways, than to be part of some solarpunk collective that is sure that it has all of the answers to everything ever.
Anyways, this is what modern times have pushed me to. Everyone, when you're young, everyone's like, "Oh, you'll become more conservative as you get older and you own things and have children and blah 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 blah." But sorry, the older I get, the more angry and radical my politics becomes. Because I think the world is also just evolving in a horrible direction right now. And but that being said, I am still clinging at least slightly to that strand of hope that is that after World War II, the peoples of the countries involved, from Japan to Germany, France, and the UK, and the USA, and so on and so forth, decided that it was time to level inequality through massive taxation of the rich. Sure, it took an extraordinarily violent world war that culminated in the dropping of two atomic bombs. Wars full of amazing loss and suffering to trigger that political decision. But even so, I think it leaves the door open, at least a little crack, for people to make that political decision without tens of millions of people having to die for it first.
I just hope that enough people have the sense to critically reevaluate the political situation we're living in and to make tangible changes towards equality so that it's a deliberate choice to treat people decently and not just some happy side effect of the mass production of wartime technologies this time around. Books like this one by Scheidel are really helpful in that regard because it gives people a knowledge of the way that history has gone so that maybe they can think critically about the way that all of this massive violence has happened and think, no, you know what? I don't want that to happen. I think we have learned these lessons already without having to go through the horrible, horrible process of learning again, and we can just start with the solutions.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Now go out there and defend democracy and fight against inequality. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.